Hello, everybody. It's Elizabeth Harrin here from Rebel's Guide to Project Management, and I am here with David Daly, who's on that side of the screen. It's always difficult to point, isn't it, when you don't know exactly where you're who is the author of a new book called Better Agile. So, hello, David. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, Elizabeth. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to see you again, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
Oh, that's quite all right. It was a long time, wasn't it, that we met at the APM conference,
Yeah,
2008?
2008. I don't know how, but it doesn't seem that long ago. But what's that? 14 years. Yeah, it's
It's gone
a
quickly.
very long time.
So, when you were at that conference, then, are you still feeling, were you talking about agile things, and is that the beginning of this evolution towards the book?
Yeah, I suppose it is. I hadn't thought of it like that, but I wasn't thinking of it in terms of agile at the time, but I remember what I was presenting at that conference was about the need to break big projects down into smaller projects and each project being able to deliver some value by itself, if that makes sense, which, as I say, I wasn't labeling it as agile, but is very much, I guess, part of the agile approach if we look at it now. So yeah, kind of is the beginning now that you now that you mention it to me.
So, I mean, you've called the book Better Agile, but what does that mean?
So
What's,
that's a great question. So I think what I've seen and what I think other people have started to see is that certainly for software, most people are now accepting that an agile approach is the best way to do things, and
Mhm.
that's executives, it's managers, it's people on teams, it's software developers. So the debate is not really so much should we move to agile, it's we have to work in an agile way. And I would say most teams are also trying to work in an agile way. But what I've seen is that people are not always getting the benefits they expect from adopting agile, and sometimes that's because they're maybe not clear at the start about what benefits they want to get. But also, I think that a lot of people pick up a kind of method like Scrum or Kanban, and they find they can apply 80% of it, but then there's 20% that is too difficult or doesn't really work in their environment. And the problem is that unless you understand a little bit about how those methods work, the thinking behind them, sometimes if you miss out that 20%, everything else doesn't really work either, if that makes
Yes.
sense. So you end up with this
Yes.
kind of, and it's not the fault of the method and it's not the fault of the people, because some of these methods you literally can't apply 100% of in every environment, but it leads to kind of problems, and then people don't really get the benefits they wanted, and sometimes they give up or they just say, well, this is the best we can do. And so with the book, I was trying to explain a little bit more what's behind the agile methods so that then people can for themselves tailor them in a successful way for their own environment, if that makes sense.
So, tailoring then is something that's been really big in project management over the last couple of years. Long overdue, in my perspective, but Prince 2's now got the latest Prince 2's got a big chunk about tailoring, and the Pinbox 7 is much more tailoring. APM body of knowledge has always been very light on process. And there's a lot more on have all these skills, but we're not going to show you how to get them. So you have to learn them and apply them, and just have that professional sense of confidence. But I suppose agile, especially methods like Scrum, have always felt to me quite prescriptive in a way, because yes, I know that you can adapt and flex and all that kind of stuff, but you have your backlog, you do your backlog grooming, you have your sprint, you do your iterations, you have your sprint planning. It feels, how do you tailor that?
Well, it's a really good point. And um, so just taking a step back, firstly to project management, which I am in no way the same level of expertise as you, Elizabeth. But I think one challenge, of course, with tailoring is that to tailor successfully, you often have to understand a lot about the entire package before you can figure out how to apply it in your context. And so
Mm.
tailoring it's kind of easy to say, but it's not always easy to do. And I think there's a lot of um, very influential people like Steve McConnell who would say, if you're going to adopt Scrum, you do it, unless you're kind of an agile guru, you do it by the book, because essentially it's very difficult to know how to tailor it if you're just starting out on that journey. But as you say, Scrum as an example, is very prescriptive. what I would say, so what I've tried to do in the book is give people the bare minimum of information that they could need to try and tailor these methods to work for them. So that's part of what I was trying to aim for, not a kind of you have to learn everything before you can think about tailoring. But also, um, if we think of Kanban, so Scrum is like the top, that is the most popular agile method. I think it's like 60 or 70% of people that are doing agile are using Scrum, and Kanban is in second place, but second place means something like 5 or 6%. It's a dramatic difference. But what's interesting there is that Kanban's quite different in that with Kanban, you start with what you do today. So whatever process you've got at the moment, you start with that, you limit the work in progress, you visualize the work, and then you iteratively improve to try and get shorter lead time and higher throughput. So Kanban is a lot less prescriptive. Interestingly, you can also, if you're already doing Scrum, you can have Scrum as your starting point, and then you can use Kanban to improve further. But again, and this is kind of skipping ahead, but I have a chapter in the book that talks about this, that I think Scrum is great when you're starting from a blank sheet of paper. So if you're setting up a new team and you can have all the right technical practices in place from day one, I think it gives you everything you need to kind of run a successful software development team. But it's a lot harder to implement where you've already got a software team that's working in a particular way, if that
Right.
makes sense.
So is that kind of a big key decision factor between whether you should go with Scrum or Kanban?
Yeah, I think, again, you probably ask 1,000 people and you'll get 1,000 different answers. But I would say Scrum, if you've already got a team working with any kind of with any approach to software development, Scrum is quite a disruptive change because you're challenging people's roles. You need certain technical practices in place, which can be very difficult with some legacy application architectures. So it's not, again, it's not that Scrum is bad. Scrum is great, but don't underestimate the difficulty of putting that in place with an existing team in certain situations. I mean, if you were hiring 8 developers and starting work on a new product, I think Scrum is not so hard to put in place. But again, probably 95% of people are not in that kind of greenfield
No,
position of starting from a complete blank sheet of paper. So there, I think Kanban
no.
has a lot to be said for it.
That's really interesting because I mentor project managers, and often the conversation comes around to they want us to be more agile, but no one's told me what that means. I'm just doing whatever I want until I'm told by some Scrum coach that I'm doing it wrong. And that's not helpful because it's that transition. It's going from thinking we need to do things better and thinking that agile methods are the answer, which they may well be, and then helping people through that transition to get those benefits. So do you think that people are choosing agile because of these benefits but are really struggling to articulate what they might be? But so
Well,
maybe that question really is, what are the benefits?
and again, it's a really good point. So if I think, so I used to, maybe arguments is an exaggeration, but I think agility in software development really started out as the ability to respond to change. So in other words, rather than having a fixed set of requirements at the start and then spending 2 years developing those and kind of resisting any change to those requirements and saying, no, they were signed off, we now have to deliver these.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, as business has become more dynamic and the requirements you have in a year's time won't be the same as the requirements you had a year ago, there was this need to respond better to changing requirements, and that's kind of the historical kind of reason for becoming more agile. The the thing is that I think a lot of executives, actually, they just want things faster, if that makes sense. So they'd like
Yes.
to ask for a feature today and have it next week, not be told you'll have it in a year's time, if that makes sense. Now, and again, this could probably start some kind of war in the agile community, but I'm not convinced that if you were building, so if you had exactly the same scope, and it stayed fixed from day one, and you tried to build it in a pure waterfall, so you did all your analysis and then all your design and then all your coding and then all your testing, or you use an agile approach and broke it up into sprints, I'm not convinced that the agile delivery would finish sooner. in practical terms, of course, the requirements never stay fixed.
No,
So
they never do.
actually, Agile does give you a benefit, because that's a very theoretical situation, which as I say, never actually happens in practice. So, but I guess what I'm saying is the idea that if you were building exactly the same thing, that you would get it 3 times as quickly using Agile, I don't think is true, and I don't think is borne out by the data. Of course, so I think sometimes executives are disappointed because they kind of think, well, I wanted all this stuff much faster, and I don't seem to be getting it faster. I think also, and this might resonate with you and people that watch this, often the changes when you're implementing Agile are as much about people outside of the software development team as inside. So, for example, one thing you absolutely have to do is know what the priority things are to work on.
Hmm.
And then you focus the team on working on those top priority items and finishing those before they work on the next set of priorities. If you can't tell the team what the top 10 priority changes are, then it doesn't matter how agile they are in their delivery, you're never going to get the benefits you're expecting. So as I say, it's not that all the change is outside of the team, but a big part of it is how you interface with other stakeholders in the organization.
That's really interesting because I was talking to other people yesterday about managing multiple projects, which is my next book. And this issue, and I did a survey of people, what do you find difficult about managing multiple projects? It's prioritization, and people don't have ways to prioritize their work because they are not told what is a priority. So they're guessing, or they're working for the people who shout the loudest, or they are trying to make that jump between what they've been asked to do and what the strategic priorities are, and trying to do that alignment themselves in the absence of any better information. And so one of the questions I got asked yesterday was, what's the top tip for making this easier? And it's just tell people what the priorities are. And if you can fix that, then your agile team can work on the right thing, your multiple project managers can work on the right things, and just it takes such a lot of stress out of the environment.
Yeah.
So it's got to be this kind of organizational setup, hasn't it? And I think what I see, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is that organizations don't set people up for success because the culture or the processes don't really seem to support the whatever best looks like for that particular
I
company.
think you're right, and
I think that's
it reminds it's funny because there was one paragraph I wrote in Better Agile, and I was like, as I wrote it, I thought, is this true? And I thought, yeah, it probably is true, because essentially and it's so like what you're saying, Elizabeth. I was kind of recognizing that if a team has one place that lists the work they've got to do, and they know what the top priorities out of that pile of work are, and that's not the same as having a fully prioritized backlog. It just means
hmm
you know what the top 10 are, and you can avoid the team getting interrupted and distracted and pushed onto other things midway through. So in other words, you know what work you've got to do, you know the top priority, and you avoid distractions and interruptions from those priorities. I think you're then way above average in terms of team performance just by doing that. And of course, it's not so easy to implement, but essentially
it
just
sounds
doing
easy
that,
though. It should
well,
be easy.
it should be. And I think the thing is, and again, what I was trying to help people do a little bit is, the reality is, if you wait for management or you wait for the stakeholders outside of the team to come to you with a prioritized list, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So there are steps that you can take proactively to engage with the people outside of the team, and basically figure out a way, some kind of mechanism to know what the priorities are, and avoid them coming directly to a developer or a
Mm.
programmer and saying, "Oh, you need to work on this now because it's the top priority because we've got this conference next week." So it's, as you say, it's not so difficult to do, but if you just wait for the company or someone else to do it, then you may be waiting for a long time.
Yes, exactly. So in your book, you talk about 3 secrets of Agile. Are there any secrets you're prepared to share today?
I'm prepared to share them all because anyone can look at the table of contents. Um,
Okay.
and this was what was interesting. It came out of this idea that, rather than looking at a particular method, saying, well, what do they all have in common? What are the things that really make agile work versus what's just a tool or a, because again, I think that's something that can happen, is people might implement Jira, or they might put a task board on the wall, and those are good tools, those are not bad tools, but often the tools by themselves don't give you the results you're expecting. um, so as I said, these three, maybe secrets is the wrong word, but the kind of the essence of Agile, I think. And the first one is optimizing for flow. So really trying to have as few things in progress as you can at a time, avoiding big batch stages. So not all changes are signed off in one go and then all changes are tested or developed in one go. So that's the flow part. The second part, which is really easy to say and harder to do, is just about getting the right people working on the right things. And
Hmm.
again, it's interesting because, what does that even mean? You would think, well, you just get the person who can do it quickest and best working on each change. But actually, sometimes if you do that, then you end up with only one person in the team who can work on one module or one part of the system. And you want to avoid those key person dependencies, because also you might have a lot of change coming in that part. And then suddenly it's, that person becomes a bottleneck. So there's quite a balancing act, I think, just in getting the right people working on the right things. And then the last one is about feedback loops, which I break up into two areas. So one is feedback about the product you're building. Is it at one level, does it not have bugs in it? But at another level, is it generating the business outcomes that your end customer was expecting? And the other kind of feedback is feedback about how the team is doing. So feedback that helps the team continually improve the way it's working, understand how it's working and improve the way they're working. So those are
So
kind
on
of the,
that,
sorry, go on.
so on that last point, then, because one of the premises of the book is less firefighting, better agile, more streamlined, less firefighting, spending less of your day in a headless chicken mode. And that last point about feedback loops really seems to speak to that, because you need to know what's not working in order to be able to improve it so that you end up firefighting less. Do you have any other how do I stop firefighting tips?
So I think and part of that is the prioritization
Hmm.
piece, because when we talk about firefighting, I think there are, let's call them genuine fires. I'm improvising here, but this is the unexpected fault in production that brings the whole system down. Well, you kind of have to drop everything and fix that. There's no debate. But then there's the kind of self-created fires where someone suddenly has remembered they've got a trade show next week that they need a demo for. Well, that was probably in the diary for 6 months. I mean, it's not anything except for something that's been created by the way a team or the people outside of the team are organized. And I remember, this is one interesting thing around prioritization, actually, that many low priority items of work have the potential to become urgent items of work. So that, it can be the
Hmm.
kind of, we need to upgrade to the latest version of Windows. Well, guess what? That's low priority until a week before Microsoft stops support for that
Yes.
version, or there's a critical vulnerability discovered, security vulnerability, and suddenly what was low priority becomes high priority. And the trick is not to jump from something that could be done anytime to something that needs to be done tomorrow. So there's kind of, I guess I say, one way to stop firefighting is to try only to have to switch into a firefighting mode for genuine things that are outside of your control. And even things like the production faults, a big part of the feedback loops we're talking about is trying to release software that doesn't have those issues in it in the first place. And again, it's just borne out by the data. The Many teams spend more than 50% of their effort basically fixing things that weren't
Really?
done right in the first place. And it depends, but it can be even more extreme than that, because
But how does that happen? Because agile teams should have, in my opinion, never having spent any time as a QA or a tester in an agile team, but I felt that there was this kind of workflow that it went through development, through peer programming, and all those quality checks and testing, and then was demoed to the client at the end of the sprint and all the rest of it, and it would pop out working. I mean, the whole idea is we do working features, isn't it?
yes, it totally is. And I think as long as you are doing that, then you are minimizing the risk. I mean, and there are also some other aspects which I do touch on. It's not really a book about DevOps, but there are, because with things like downtime, one way that you can reduce that is by having a quick automated rollback, for example.
Okay.
So if there's a problem, you can just switch back to the previous version. And again, that takes what was a fire to something that you can plan and spend time on, if that makes sense. The
Mm.
other option you have, for example, is phased rollout. So the classic example is Facebook, where every new feature, first of all, goes just to Facebook employees, and then it kind of goes to 10% of the user base, and then it goes to 100% of the user base. But the point there is they monitor each incremental release, and if they spot problems, then they can kind of roll back before most of the users would even see it. So I think but what you're saying is right, that if you have the feedback loops in place, then that minimizes these risks. The problem is, coming back to some of those difficulties with Agile, is that sometimes if you try and apply Scrum to a system where you haven't got automated regression tests, well, you literally can't do the testing you need to do every 4 weeks or every 2 weeks, depending what your sprint length is. And so people don't. And that's,
Mm.
immediately then the whole thing kind of falls apart. So it's one thing that comes up in the book, is to make Scrum work, you pretty much have to have some level of automated regression testing that you can run. If you haven't got that, you'll need to have a different way of becoming more agile.
So, what other challenges do you see or struggles do you see from people who are trying to adopt Agile?
I
So, not
think,
having the right tools is one.
yep. So I think there's, as I say, there's not having the right tools. There's what I mentioned earlier about how you can tailor it to your context. But I
Sorry,
also
very
think
unprofessional. My phone going off.
it's all right. It shows that it's live.
It's live. And hopefully, I've turned it off. Sorry, carry on.
Um, I think as well, if we again just think of how agile has evolved. I was talking to a guy who teaches software at a university, software development at a university, and he was, I mean, you might remember this as well, Elizabeth. Agile used to be this kind of lightweight method,
Yes.
where look at this crazy Prince 2 where you have volumes to study and certification and everything. Well, guess what? Now, for many of the agile methods, there are volumes to study and there's certification, and it's really quite challenging even just to get started with it. And I think, again, it was a challenge for me when I was trying to adopt a sort of agile method with my team, was just understanding enough to even make the first choice and take the first step. And
Mm.
again, that's why what I was trying to do, and I can share the questions. I mean, they're not secret. In fact, they're open source, but is give people questions they can ask where they don't first need to understand everything about Scrum or everything about Kanban or everything about extreme programming or everything about test-driven development, but just some simple questions they can ask about how their team's working, to give them a place to start, if that makes sense. Because like I say, it's become, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it has become a complex thing where 15 years ago it was probably being heralded as this new, simpler approach, and I really don't think it is now for many people.
So, I hadn't planned to ask you this, but as you brought it up, what do you think about scaled agile?
So now I'm wondering if I have to give a politically correct answer or not. So um,
I saw an interesting fact about it yesterday, so it's top
do
of mind for me. But you tell me your views.
okay, and then will you share the interesting fact afterwards? Or
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Um, so if we look at something like SAFe, so I think it's in principle good. It combines together a lot of different existing bodies of knowledge in a kind of coherent way. I Again, just taking that as an example, I think the way they look to scale agile is by synchronizing. So you have the idea of the release train, and you're essentially synchronizing the work of all teams. I think, again, practically that can be very challenging in many organizations. And so I'm not sure it's the approach I would take, because I think, again, my view, but also the view of other people, is that what you should try and do is make the teams somewhat independent of each other, standalone, and therefore not have to synchronize every release activity between all the teams. But I guess what I would say is something like SAFe or less, these are big frame, coming back to the topic of what you have to understand. I mean, it's not that one team lead can read a book in a week and then implement SAFe for their organization. I mean, it's a big undertaking to do. And that also, I think, is part of the challenge, because my nature, and I'm not saying this is right, but I tend to prefer approaches that can be a little bit more, I don't know if I'm saying bottom up, but where you don't have to change the whole organization in one. And that's the other thing. If you look at SAFe, well, it works if everyone's doing it, but that means you've got to get for everyone from where they are now into the
Yes, to where
target
you need them to
state.
be.
And I
And
would
it's
say it's,
top down. It feels,
yeah, and it's probably easier to kind of say, okay, well, this team could implement Agile this way, this team could Agile, oh, and now we could link them together in this way. And okay, now this other team could do this. Okay, we could link them in and build it up progressively. So that I think would and has been my, I mean, even at the team level, you pick part of it or part of your scope and you apply some agility to that, and then you say, okay, well, where could we go next? And to me, that's a well, again, I have to be a bit careful here. So to me, that's a lower risk approach, that's more likely to give you the benefits you want. The caveat I have to put on this, because it's what I wrote in another book, which I'm not talking about today. The caveat is this whole, when you're talking about change management in an organization, I always think you have to balance the risk of a rapid big bang approach with the urgency you have. So if you were going to go out of business next month, if you don't become more agile, then it's probably worth the risk of a huge big bang approach, because you've got no other option. If you can afford to take a little bit more time, then I would go for a lower risk approach. But obviously every situation is different. So for me to say always do bottom up and always do incremental, that won't be true in every case. I still think it's probably true in most cases. But now I'm dying to hear your
the interesting fact. Well, Stefan Wolper's Age of Product newsletter came out yesterday or recently. Maybe I only read it yesterday. It might have been in my inbox. And he had done a survey on the net promoter score of SAFe, and it was minus 56. So generally, from his community of people who completed his study, SAFe was not something that they would recommend organizations adopt. And I just thought that was interesting, because it it makes sense to me because of exactly what you've just said around the fact that Agile should be small and nimble and and organizationally efficient, whatever that looks like. And maybe that does look big for some organizations and all linked together. That's great if you're a software house and that's what you do. If you are an insurance company, you've still got an IT team who might want to work in an agile way, and your marketing team might take agile approaches for their campaigns or website design or that kind of thing, but your legal department are probably not. And so how do you reconcile all of that? And I'm not an agile expert like you are. I mean, I don't have the depth of knowledge that you do, so I just wanted. It felt like that was a really interesting take from the agile community on what
but if
SAFe was,
I
and it sounds like you would agree.
well, I think I would, but I kind of, in some ways, I don't want to turn it into a safe bashing set, because I
No,
think
no.
the other, what also could explain that low NPS score is that SAFe is trying to do something really hard. And if I give an
Yes.
example, it's kind of, it's a classic example that everyone talks about. So Salesforce adopted Agile throughout the whole company. And at the time, this was a few years ago, and they had 200 engineers. So it's big, but it's not thousands. It's 200 engineers. And I think they were rolling out something like Scrum. I'm not sure it was pure Scrum. But I think even with the whole executive management fully behind the change, and with external consultants brought in to support the change, it took them, I think, a year to implement. And then they had to do more around automation and the engineering side. And I think it took them 2 years before they felt they'd really got the benefit from that change. And the thing is, I don't think anyone would say Salesforce is like a slow
No.
moving, old fashioned company. But, with full executive support, external consultants brought in, and a real drive to change, it was 2 years to see the benefit. And that's the other thing, you've probably seen the sort of the curve of change, where you kind of have this time where things don't get better, they get worse, and things are harder before you see some benefits. And if you go company wide, then that's going to be a longer and deeper trough that you have to get through before you see the benefits. Whereas if you do small changes, of course, then you get lots of little troughs, and it's kind of
Yes,
it
the
requires
incremental
less
benefits.
kind of motivation to persevere through the difficult part, I
Now,
think.
that's interesting because that's the change management process of organizational transformation and people thinking, but it's agile, so I can have it fast. But you don't get to the agile, I can have the agile benefits until the organizational transformation is finished. Or at least you might get bits of it on the way, but the
Yeah.
full realization of those benefits from transforming your organization won't come until the organization is transformed. And if that takes you 2 years to get to top performance, it will definitely be worth it
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
you'll then from then on reap all of those benefits and be streets ahead of your competition. But it's that change curve thing that feels to me, and
Yeah.
in my background is waterfall projects, predictive methodologies, and we have the same challenge. If the change management isn't done right, whatever we've delivered, however long we've spent on it, it just flops, and
Yeah. Yeah.
change adoption isn't there. So it's kind of a fundamental project management problem of we want to do things differently, we want to change things. How do we make sure that change lands?
But I did
And if
it. Sorry, go
sorry,
on.
no, I've finished.
I was
I
because
could
I was,
waffle about change forever.
but I was just thinking again because at the end of the book, I had very much in mind, what can people do with this? And I tried to set out some things that are quick wins. I'm not sure I like the term, but anyway, quick wins versus some things that are going to require some investment and be longer term. And it's coming back to what we were saying earlier. For a lot of teams, the way you get out of firefighting is you get some prioritization in place and you reduce the total number of things that people are working on. That's kind of, and then that space might mean you can have some retrospectives and help, and people can identify some other improvements that you can implement. And that space might mean that maybe one of those improvements is, okay, we're now going to spend 10% of our time each week starting to automate the testing, for example. But it's so each change brings a little benefit, but so if you can't do the short-term things to get a little bit of breathing space, then it's really hard to justify the longer term things and to find the time for those. So I think again, it's, to me, in change, you do have to very practically find some steps you can take quickly that give you some benefit, however small, that then allows you to take the next steps that give you the bigger benefits later.
Mm, interesting. Okay. Gosh, I feel like this has turned into quite a wide-ranging conversation.
Indeed, indeed. I'm just looking. I can't believe, yeah, we've already been talking for over half an hour, haven't
I
we,
know,
Elizabeth?
I know, and I know I need to let you go. So I wondered whether there was any last tips or takeaways that you had from the book that you'd be prepared to share, or a tip for someone thinking about the situation they're in with their agile team and what they could perhaps do to get to a position of having better agile.
So I think the well, I'm going to give you three that
Okay.
I can think of. So essentially, the, in terms of delivering software changes faster, most teams, the biggest part of that lead time is time spent waiting for someone to work on it. So don't focus your energy on how people can develop or code faster. Focus your energy on how you can reduce the wait times between those
Mm,
activities taking place. That will give you the biggest improvements fastest. The second one, coming back to efficiency, is um, since most teams spend an awful lot of time fixing things that weren't done right in the first place, if you can reduce the effort spent fixing things by getting it right first time, that will improve your efficiency again much better than any tooling that helps you code faster. Or again, it's the single easiest area you can improve. And then the final one is this whole idea of work in progress, which for Scrum you limit the number of stories in a sprint. With Kanban you limit the number of work items that you have in progress at any one time. But again, if people on your team have more than two or three, so if you've got a team of 5 people, to make the maths simple, if you've got more than 15 changes in progress at any one time, then lower it so that you've got a maximum of 2 or 3 changes per person. And again, it's not the one-stop solution, but for most teams that will give you benefits straight away. So those are kind of 3 things to look at or that you can do, which again, not for every team, but in a lot of cases, those will give you the benefits.
that's great. Thank you very much. So tell us how we can get the book.
Well, I hadn't prepared this. You can see it's my first book, Elizabeth. I'm not so, but you can, if you, it's available on Amazon. So if you search for Better Agile on Amazon, it should come up. Or if it doesn't come up with that, search for my name and you'll find it on Amazon. And it's also, because I love the concept of lean pub. I don't know if you've heard this, but it's a way of publishing books that are works in progress. So it's probably not the biggest marketplace, but it's also available on leanpub.com if you search for Better Agile,
Very
because it's
agile way of publishing. I like it. I'll need to
indeed,
look into
indeed,
that.
yeah,
I'm not sure
yeah.
I'd want my half-finished books out there in the world, but
Yeah. It's kind of, it's a whole different model, but it's, I say, either Amazon or Leanpub. You can search for it there and find it. And I also, always love to hear back from people and hear what they thought of it, and any kind of experience they have from trying to put it into practice. I love to hear that.
well, I can tell you that Abbas has just left a comment saying thank you for this amazing discussion. So you've obviously had an impact this morning just with what we've talked about.
Well,
So we can go away.
likewise, or you have, Elizabeth.
I've done hardly any talking. What are you talking about?
No, but it's been a real pleasure. It's been so nice to catch up with you again. I've really appreciated that. So thank
No,
you.
it's been nice, and wish you all the best for the book. And I'll post a link under the video of how people can get hold of that. And then we'll catch up when you write another one. Let's not leave it so long, though.
Yeah, I better get started. Super.
Yes.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
All
Take
right. Have a
care.
great rest of the day. Thanks,
You too.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Are we back in the green room now?
We are back behind the scenes.
Was that okay for you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, that
Good.
was fine. I felt very